painting, The Philosopher's Camp in the Adirondacks by William James Stillman is one of the best known in the Concord Free Public Library Corporation's art collection and is currently on display at the Concord Museum in a special exhibition featuring the library's art collection. So if you have not gone to see the exhibit, please do. It is going to be up through September 4th, but tomorrow is a great day. Since the painting by Stillman is on loan to the museum, what I chose to display here is a pencil drawing by Emerson's son, Edward Walter Emerson, which is a key to the figures in the painting, and it was a gift of the artist to the library. During the summer of 1858, the artist, William James Stillman, organized a group of distinguished writers and naturalists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Russell Lowell, Ebenezer Rockwood Hoare, and others, to join Harvard professor Louis Agassiz on a field expedition and camping trip to the Adirondacks. The artwork commemorates the Adirondack Club, an offshoot of the Boston-based Saturday Club, a gathering of literary men and of scholars of Concord, Cambridge, and Boston. Agassiz, a key member of the club, was one of the most renowned naturalists of his day, even celebrated with a bust presented to the Concord Free Public Library by citizens of the town. We also discovered just today, in researching the guest register for the opening day of the library, October 1st, 1873, that Agassiz attended, along with many other distinguished guests, including abolitionist Wendell Phillips, author Henry James, and statesman Charles Sumner. While without question Agassiz was a celebrity in his day, his legacy today as a scientist is disreputable for his efforts to promote, quote, scientific racism and the dehumanizing images he commissioned of enslaved people. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Christoph Irmscher, who will discuss how American intellectuals like Emerson, who fell for Agassiz, made sense of his racism. Drawing on recent work, his talk suggests that the distance between the woods of New England and the Amazon rainforest, where Agassiz staged his last significant scientific coup, is not as great as one might imagine. Professor Irmscher is the author of several books, including The Poetics of Natural History, Longfellow Redux, Louis Agassiz, Creator of American Science, and Max Eastman, A Life. Among his editions are John James Audubon's Writings and Drawings, and Stephen Spender's Poems Written Abroad. His most recent book is Audubon at Sea with Richard King for the University of Chicago Press. Irmscher is Distinguished Professor of English at Indiana University Bloomington, where he's also director of the Wells Scholars Program. Welcome, Professor Irmscher.
Thank you so much, Anke, and it's great to be here. And if I'm not making sense or you have a question, you can interrupt me while I talk. I have no problem with that at all. I have spent a great deal of time working on Agassiz, and let me see if I can forward the image. There we go. And I seem to have a tendency to write about people who get somewhat compromised or whose legacy becomes a problem as I'm working on them. So Audubon is definitely one of them, and I can say something about that as well. In terms of Agassiz, I started working on Agassiz or becoming interested in him in the Poetics of Natural History, which was a comprehensive, at least I intended it to be, analysis of early natural history writing. And Agassiz was the final chapter. And I became interested in the ways in which race and biology intersect in Agassiz's work. And the final chapter was, in fact, about photographs that Agassiz used in his investigations of race. I ended up writing a biography of Agassiz. Again, this was not intentional. There was just so much material, and it grew and amassed itself, and it became a biography. And then I did an edition of one of the key texts, one of the early texts in Agassiz's work. And I'm not saying this in order to demonstrate how accomplished I am. It's just sort of, it's been a long, long journey, and also a journey trying to understand what to do with them. My first account of Agassiz was not a positive one, I need to say, and I will return to that in a minute. So I want to begin with this photograph that is not as well known. You've probably seen photographs of the collapsed statue during the earthquake in 1906. It's the April 21st, 1906. This particular photograph is interesting, and I think I'm the only one who actually has a copy of it. You see a Stanford student, Percy Blodgett, and we know it's Percy Blodgett because the particular photograph that I have is actually signed. There's an inscription on the back next to the marble statue of Agassiz, who ended up headfirst in the ground during the California earthquake. And it became sort of a tourist attraction. People would come and have themselves photographed right next to it. And you can see one of the things that I love about this particular picture is the bicycle in the background too, which might be Percy's, we do not know. Percy is standing here, he's quite cocky, he's wearing a sports coat, a tie, and he has his hand resting on Agassiz, on the pedestal of the statue. The bicycle kind of represents, in a sense, the modern world. You know, Percy maybe took the bike to get there. This is the past, and it's headfirst in the ground. And there's a famous pun that was actually popularized by David Starr Jordan, the founding president of Stanford, who happened to be present on one of these afternoons when students basically were surrounding this, the collapsed Agassiz. And apparently someone said, Agassiz is great in the abstract, but not in the concrete, right? And so David Starr Jordan is an interesting case too, and I might say a few things about him too. He is the founding president of Stanford, but he was also before the president of Indiana University, where I teach, and his own legacy is compromised for involvement in eugenics and so forth. I'll say a little more about that later. But the pun, as funny as it is, Agassiz is great in the abstract but not in the concrete, is actually not accurate. For the very simple reason that Agassiz, as he liked to see himself represented, was in fact fantastic in the concrete. That's part of his legacy. His enduring legacy in American natural history is the importance of fieldwork. He came in 1846 from Switzerland, his native Switzerland, with an enormous track record already in glaciology. And he reformed the way science was done in America, not only by creating what was arguably the first graduate school in American academe, by surrounding himself at Harvard with hugely qualified natural history students, but also because he was really someone who insisted that you go out and look for yourself. He's famous for having said, one needs to catch nature in the act. He said it in French, prendre nature sur le fait, he said, and that's what he wanted to accomplish. And he did so in a number of ways. He created the first oceanographic institution laboratory in the United States outside Nahant. And he was famous among his, basically with everybody, because he would wade into the water. He was interested in jellyfish, and jellyfish are elusive things. So if you want to capture a jellyfish and you want to actually observe it, it's probably not going to survive. So Agassiz, in one famous instance, took his microscope and plunged into the water. No one had ever seen anybody do things like that. He was, in fact, famous for pulling out specimens during his lectures out of his pockets. Live specimens. There's a famous anecdote that after he married his second wife, after his marriage, Elizabeth Carey Agassiz, descended from Boston, a blue blood stock, that she was one night was terrified because she was, I think, getting into her bedroom slippers or boots or whatever, and she said, "There's snakes here." And Agassiz said, "Oh, that's where they are." Because he had all these specimens, live specimens and dead specimens. So somebody who could not get enough of nature. He was famous as a lecturer. And one of his tricks was, and this only worked a couple of times apparently, but he would draw things on the blackboard. Sometimes he would just start with one little detail and have people guess what it was going to be. But one of his secrets was that Agassiz was ambidextrous. So he would start with the right hand and start drawing. He would talk and turn to the blackboard, and suddenly the left hand would come up and would do that too, and people would faint, essentially, when he did that. So he was a bit of a showman, actually, and he used that to great advantage when he was at his best. He had this very charming French-inflected English, which was usually worked really well. There was one word, reportedly, that he couldn't pronounce, and that was development, which is very interesting for somebody who was an anti-evolutionist. So he would always say développement, because he could not say development. So there's one word that he couldn't do. And one of the things I thought, I don't have specimens, but I'm going to hand out a couple of things that you can look at. And they're not very valuable, because that's what Agassiz did. And I'm not trying to be like a pseudo-Agassiz, but it's kind of fun to hold things in your hands. This is a ruler that has Agassiz's main motto, which is on the other side, actually, study nature, not books. That's what Agassiz was famous for. It's actually something that Woods Hole, despite all the problems they now have with being associated with Agassiz, that's something that they still use. Study nature, not books. And just to give you a sense of what a rock star he was, I'm going to hand out some of these. These are little carte de visite, which were essentially sort of 19th century calling cards. And these are portraits of Agassiz, and you can just look at them. The one thing that is special is this one, because it's actually autographed. So that's his handwriting. It's inscribed by himself. So he would have handed that out. And so here's some more. And I have some of these postcards as well. I'll just give it to you. And there you go. And you can turn it around. There's another one, and that's a modern postcard, in fact. So that's Agassiz at the blackboard. He was, and this is not surprising, he really sort of presented himself to his contemporaries as the embodiment of what it meant to do science. In fact, he was science. He was science personified, in a sense. I became convinced as I was working on him that he really wasn't all that interested sometimes in being a scientist than in doing science than he was in being a scientist, being known as a scientist. He was in love with the methods of science, with representing himself that way. There's a very kind of a shocking diary entry by one of his students, one of his best students, and they had a massive falling out later, a man named Henry James Clark, who was brilliant and became a kind of confidant at one point. And he records a conversation that he had with Agassiz, where Agassiz took him aside and he said, "You know what? I haven't actually looked at things in a long time anymore. I do most of my work from memory." And Henry James Clark said, "Oh my God, this is my hero. This is the guy I adore. And he's just telling me I don't look at things anymore. I've reached a point where I can just use my brain to do scientific work." He was also, and this is part of his legacy, and I'm talking about the good parts of his legacy, he was also known and effective as a writer, as a popularizer of science. He wrote popular essays published in the Atlantic Monthly. But even in his more technical works, like Contributions to the Natural History of the United States of America, which was supposed to be his masterwork, he had planned it to be 10 volumes long. It was going to be the main work about American natural history. Even in his textbooks, so to speak, if you want to look at this as a textbook, he was a brilliant writer. And I've given you a passage here. This is indicative of Agassiz's success on the page, which was to some extent also responsible for what Emerson and others loved about him. I'm just going to read this passage to you because you need to get the dynamic of the passage. It is indeed a wonderful sight to see a little animal not larger than a hazelnut, as transparent as crystal, as soft as jelly, as perishable as an air bubble, run actively through as dense a medium as water, pause at times and stretch its tentacles, and now dart suddenly into one direction or another, turn around upon itself, and move suddenly in the opposite direction, describe spirals like a bird of prey, rising in the air, or shoot in a straight line like an arrow, and perform all these movements with as much grace and precision, and elongate and contract its tentacles, throw them at its prey, and secure in that way its food, with as much certainty as could a larger animal provided with flesh and bones, teeth and claws, and all the different sword and hard parts which we consider generally as indispensable requisites for energetic action, though these little creatures are, strictly speaking, nothing more than a little mass of cellular gelatinous tissue. There's one sentence only, and in a scientific textbook, this is something that Melville would produce, a Moby Dick, right? And it's actually, he gets a lot of work done in the passage. When you look, the topic is really, we're looking at something very tiny that is as different from anything that we know as possible. And he gives us a couple of comparisons. And he essentially said, spirals like a bird of prey, right? Shoot in a straight line like an arrow. It's an arrow. It's like an arrow. It's like a bird of prey. And then, so this is sort of like the climax of the comparison. A larger animal provided with flesh and bones, teeth and claws, and all the different soft and hard parts which we consider generally as indispensable requisites for energetic action. So this is an extended comparison. He's saying, given all these comparisons, it's as unlike all those things, and yet it isn't. It is gelatinous tissue after all. But it gets all these things done that we wouldn't associate with something as insignificant as this. And the topic of the passage is really wonder. And this was one of Agassiz's, the main things that he wanted to convey. Wonder at nature, wonder at the glorious, glorious works of nature, which for Agassiz were the works of God. And God, in Agassiz's understanding, was not a conventionally Christian God. In fact, the Bostonians noticed that he didn't go to church at all. He was not the church-going kind, Longfellow wrote about him. So he was not to be found in services. His father was a minister, a Calvinist minister in Switzerland, but he had nothing to do with organized religion. In fact, there's sort of touch points with transcendentalism, the notion that divinity resides in the here and now. That's exactly what Agassiz conveyed from a scientific perspective. You look at what's around you. You look at gelatinous tissue and you find wonder in it. And I'm going to tell you why. And I'm going to tell you again and again and again, because this is Agassiz's main theme. And there's another thing that is almost as important for him, and this is where the puzzle box theme comes in. He believes that if we are just patient enough, if we all become scientists, theoretically speaking, because that was his goal, we can understand the world. The world is fully comprehensible, given enough time and work. It's like the geologist's puzzle box. He stands before it like the child to whom the separate pieces of the puzzle remain a mystery, till he detects their relation and sees where they fit. And then his fragments grow at once into a connected picture beneath his hand. It's essentially a variation on the passage from the Corinthians. Now we see through a glass darkly, but soon we shall see all. And there's a bit of hubris involved in that too, but one that resonated with New Englanders. we do have inside us, because of how we function, the capacity to understand God, to understand the mysteries of nature. And science is the key part of that. And that's also why he popularized science. It was important to make everybody a scientist, really, theoretically speaking. And he was enormously successful in getting the larger public to sign on because he would solicit specimens. Thoreau sent turtles from Concord. People sent fish from all over the nation. He published circulars in which he said, this is what I need for my work. Send them to me in Cambridge, and these foul-smelling fish would arrive because everybody, there were so many fishermen in the nation. And Agassiz said, that's cool. They're all naturalists. I can deputize them in my work. I have the whole American people at my disposal, essentially. And one of the things, there's a really interesting little essay that he wrote on Psalm 8. It's one of the very few non-scientific things that are in his papers, where he essentially argues with a biblical vision of the world and with the psalmist himself. And he says, to fear annihilation of the human mind on account of death, is it not as weak and puerile as the error of these simple children of nature who thought the sun was extinct when they saw the moon pass over and hide his face at midday? So essentially, to be afraid of life ending is stupid as far as Agassiz is concerned. Wonder exceeds those limitations, the limitations also of one human mind, because we are all pieces of the divine mind which we can, in fact, reconstruct. His vision of the world is entirely teleological. There will be, at the end, complete understanding. It also works beautifully when you raise money for science, because you basically say, it's the key to the world, right? Support me. And this is what people did. This is the reason why he was able to start the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, because he was able to convince the legislature, he was able to convince private citizens to sign onto his program, right? So the important thing is that non-scientists loved him too, and this is what Anke mentioned in her introduction. Thoreau became a collector. He invited him to actually participate in a series of natural history lectures, and Agassiz wrote back and said, I can't do it because my business is nature. You know, he was always sort of grandiose. He said, I don't have time for these things. Of course, untrue. He gave plenty of lectures. He just couldn't be interested in this particular prospect. Longfellow's wife, Fanny, who was one of the smartest women of her time, she, and very radical in some ways, she was a pacifist. She loved Agassiz. She said, this is what we need in this cold, distant New England world that I live in. She wrote in her journal, everyone is too busy or too domestic to do anything, she said. There is no promenade, she said, and referring to Cambridge, no corso, referring to Rome, where one can meet and exchange a few refreshing words. No gallery to lounge in, but the dreary Athenaeum, where I rarely meet a soul I know. So she's basically sort of rebelling against sort of the social mores in Cambridge, you know, where she hated these calling days where people would show up with visiting with their cards, and, you know, you had to be available and guide them into your drawing room and then make awkward conversation. Agassiz embodied the European flair, conversation, interesting ideas, somebody who liked to drink, who liked to eat. Emerson commented always on Agassiz's bulk because he was a good eater. You know, he represented even physically the kind of acquisitiveness that made his museum so effective, right? Emerson called him a man to be thankful for. And William James famously accompanied him to Brazil, and I'll say something about this later, because he figured that this was going to be a lifetime experience, which it was, but in a different way than William James had anticipated. And it didn't seem to matter all that much that Agassiz, especially after the publication of Origin of Species, was on the defensive, because, as I already mentioned, Agassiz was an anti-evolutionist. Here you have them again. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and I'll mention him later, Emerson, and then William James in Brazil. He wasn't ready for the impact of Darwinism, and he wasn't ready for this particular man, Asa Gray, a professor of botany at Harvard, who was Darwin's advocate, Darwin's representative in the United States, who was not fun to be with. He was not charismatic. He was everything that Agassiz was not, or nothing that Agassiz was. It's probably a better way of putting it. He was a Presbyterian. He was devout. He ran to church. He never had time for anything but scientific things, but he was smart and prepared. And Agassiz had a couple of public discussions in which Asa Gray, this little man, humiliated him in ways that he had not foreseen. It did not make much of an impact on his public appreciation. It did not have an impact on what Agassiz did scientifically. It also did not have an impact on the public what his racial views were, and it became increasingly clear actually from the beginning what his beliefs were. And that's a bit of a puzzle when you want to think about Agassiz's development. He showed no trace of interest in racial matters before he came to the US. And that's not just because he hadn't experienced the US. There were folks, people he studied with, Friedrich Tiedemann is an example, an anatomist who studied race scientifically. Humboldt, his great mentor, wrote about race in his works. Agassiz showed no interest in these things at all. Rather surprisingly, when he came to the United States in 1846, in his first public lectures, the Lowell Lectures, there's a little reference at the end of the first series of lectures in which he suggested that Genesis only applied to white people, which is sort of the first step to developing his concept of special creations, of polygenism. Asa Gray was in the audience, and he immediately picked up on it. And he wrote to a friend in New York, another botanist, John Torrey. He said, he does not understand these things as we do. So which essentially he's saying two things. He's not American, and Asa Gray kept coming back to that. He doesn't understand how explosive these things are. And he's also essentially saying, this is going to be serious, what he's up to. One also has to remember in this context, because you often hear about Agassiz that he didn't make racial things central to his teachings. And it is true that they were not in his more scientific work. This is not something that he addressed. However, he did write about it in his popular writings. He has the sad distinction of being one of the first to have used the camera for purposes of racial documentation and quotation marks. And these are the famous Seeley daguerreotypes, which are at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, a series of 15 images taken in 1850 near Columbia, South Carolina, not taken by Agassiz, not even initiated by Agassiz, but they were taken on his behalf and for him to use. So they were sent to Cambridge because it was understood that Agassiz could use them in his work. Agassiz had prided himself on being able to identify the tribal origins of enslaved people, and you see a reference to Guinea here, that he could tell just from looking at them. He had been visiting various plantations and had sort of left his mark on the people who traveled with him, and this was kind of a gift to him. The Seeley daguerreotypes are hugely controversial, and some of you might know that Harvard is embroiled in a lawsuit that to some extent has to do with the return of one particular image in this series to the descendants or as some say, someone who claims to be descended from one of these subjects portrayed. These images are, and I won't say much about them because they've been discussed so much, they were produced by a photographer, Joseph T. Seeley, who was very good at what he did. And you can see that this is someone who knows how to handle a camera, how to handle light, and how to pose his subject in, if for sad reasons, in an effective way. I will talk more about other images that he took in Brazil. And just to insert, because I didn't mention this earlier, when Emerson said that Agassiz was a man to be thankful for, this actually occurred in a conversation about Brazil. Agassiz had returned from Brazil, and they met, and they were sitting on the shores of the ocean, and Agassiz talked about the sad effects of racial mixing in Brazil. And Agassiz and Emerson was enthralled. He said, he's just amazing. He's full of information, a vast storehouse of facts, and we need to be thankful for him. This was at the time that Agassiz also had weighed in, or shortly after he had weighed in on the future of America post the Civil War, in which he essentially advocated a segregationist approach, which he did explain in a series of letters to the Freedmen Commission inquiry. They had asked him for his expert opinion on the future of the United States. So on April Fool's Day, 1865, Agassiz left with an expedition for Brazil. And why Brazil? Two reasons. Agassiz was very interested, had been interested in Brazil from his earliest days. His dissertation was, in fact, a dissertation that he completed in natural history. Agassiz got 2 doctorates, an MD and a doctorate in natural history. His first publication was, in fact, about Brazilian fish, written in Latin, beautifully illustrated. So in a sense, traveling to Brazil was a fulfillment of something that was a life's dream. He was finally going to see what he had written about in the beginning of his career in the flesh. Secondly, Brazil still had slavery on the books, became the world's last country to actually officially end slavery. So it's sort of a way of getting out of a situation where slavery had ended and taking his work to a country where it was still in effect. It was also something that he felt would scientifically allow him to document through photography his notion that races were created at different points in time, that there were different creations for different races, which is the essence of polygenism. Longfellow, in one of the very few critical remarks that he made about Agassiz, it was only in his journal. Longfellow was averse to any kind of controversy, but he came home and wrote in his journal, he thinks there were several Adams and Eves, which is, of course, Longfellow saying, this is a joke, this is absurd. But that's as far as he would go. And he would still have dinner with Agassiz, would still hang out with him. Remember what Fanny said, he's such an interesting man. We cannot afford not to be in his company. So he started working, besides collecting fish, of course, he collected photographs. He started out working with a photographer in Rio, Augusto Stahl, in whom scholars are now very interested, who didn't pan out as well as Agassiz had expected, partially because he was, like Seeley, perhaps too good a photographer. So instead of showing the subjects in positions that were scientifically useful or demeaning, Stahl, because he had an interest in photography, positioned his subjects in ways that made them something other than just objects. So he would have them look up or look down or turn to the side. He would still produce the required 3 ethnographic shots or positions that became, after Huxley had recommended that this is how ethnographic work has to be done, the norm for this type of photography. So it was front, side, and back. Stahl did that, and I just took one installment out of one of these series. But Agassiz abandoned that, and he moved his whole party to Manaus, which was very much
a kind of frontier town at the time, and that's where he really went to town as a photographer. And we have a series of more than 120 glass negatives, which are the Peabody Museum, in the collections of the Peabody Museum, where he photographed his subjects, and he didn't do it himself, in a dilapidated courtyard, an abandoned government building that was given for his use. And you can see there's debris on the floor. It's a rather depressing sight. I'll show you the entire picture. By contrast, I included Agassiz's self-portrait again. And this is a view from the back. You can see that this building is essentially in ruins, which of course sort of adds a little bit to the kind of humiliating nature of the whole scene. The chair is included for measurement because that became sort of a way of establishing something would allow you to be more explicit about the proportions. And I'm not showing you frontal images or side images because it's always like a little dubious, do you participate in displaying these things when you make them part of a slideshow. We do not know how he recruited these people. It would be really interesting to know more about this. They're men, women, old women, young men, young women, children, and several of them. In one of them, a mother is holding a child, and they're shown in various stages of undress. Some are fully clothed initially, and then naked. We do not know how he got them to shed their clothes. The clothes are included for reference, as you can see in this particular image. Then he had them pose for the camera. The photographs were taken by Walter Hunnewell, who was a recent Harvard graduate who had just learned how to use a camera. So there's a real difference between the Seelie daguerreotypes, which were done by a professional photographer in a studio, and these snapshots, which were done, and snapshots is not quite the accurate term, by a very young, badly trained young man who was also very clumsy. And you can tell that when you look at the glass negatives, some of them, sometimes you have a thumbprint on them because he handled them. He's doing this also under tropical conditions, which is additionally hard. Sometimes the images are not fully coated because he didn't get around to doing it. And it's very hard to imagine what happened in this courtyard. We do have evidence because they're so amateurish. This is Agassiz walking into an image. He was present for all of those, and in a nice sort of tropical white suit, commanding, ordering Hunnewell to do things a certain way. So he was, in fact, observing these images, which is again different from the Seelie daguerreotypes. Agassiz was not present for any of these. He was definitely present for those shots. So one could say that, again, in this case, and it has been said, that Agassiz didn't do much with these images. He took them with him, he took them back to Harvard, and this is where they remain. They were not publicly displayed for all we know. We do know, however, that there's one image that was reused, and this is a particularly interesting one. You can see that, it was a painful experience. One can't read too much into these images. But you see this is not a face, she's frowning, this is not a face that readily consents to what is being done with them. Some of them were probably enslaved, others were poor, maybe they were promised something, there's no record of that, or they didn't expect what was going to happen to them. But this particular young woman, and you can see that she's actually dressed up, that she showed up probably wearing her finery for this particular image. This young woman does actually show up, as I discovered, in an engraving that was added to the French translation of a book that Elizabeth Agassiz wrote about the trip called Voyage in Brazil. This is the French version. So this particular one was reused and it's slightly different, slightly embellished in a slightly different way. So it's not something that he actively hid, or as some people have said, he was maybe embarrassed about what he was doing. The best explanation I have, Agassiz started so many things that he didn't finish. So many things that he didn't get to. He was constantly starting new projects. That this was one of them too. The contributions to the natural history of America, which I mentioned earlier, didn't make it beyond the jellyfish and the turtles. He never got to any other part of American natural history. That's another example of his unfinished work. So, what to do with Agassiz today? So one, and I'll wrap up with that, one particular approach, of course, has been erase names from the many things that were named after him, even in his lifetime. Some of you might remember a trailblazer was the Agassiz Elementary School in Cambridge. That was one of the first to rename itself. The Maria Baldwin School, after an 8th grader had read Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man and come across Agassiz's racial views. And that has happened in other places too. The most recent one was, as far as I know, the Agassiz Elementary School on the north side of Chicago that renamed itself is now the Harriet Tubman School. The Maria Baldwin School set an example for that. So erase the legacy, replace Agassiz with more prominent names. Scientists would say, well, that doesn't really compromise his science, that his science was a separate part, and I've already responded to that. Also, the renaming initiatives or renaming don't always work. It's easy with smaller things. Larger things are more problematic. Mount Agassiz in New Hampshire, as far as I know, is holding strong, and so is the Agassiz Horn in Switzerland. There were attempts to have it renamed, but they were rejected by the Swiss authorities. Sometimes nature takes care of things. The Agassiz column can no longer be seen because it's completely overgrown in Yosemite Valley with other vegetation. So nature has taken care of that. If you want. This is the Agassiz Horn in Switzerland. We had a similar situation on my campus, Indiana University, where David Starr Jordan, who was a student of Agassiz, his name was on our biology building, and there was an initiative that was supported by the biology department. Everyone signed on to it to have his name erased from the building and also from the street named after him. This is the old inscription. One of the sad things about renaming is that once you achieve your goal, all these discussions that happen that are really instructional and interesting are suddenly over, and it's gone. We have a new generation of students who doesn't even remember this David Starr Jordan was associated with Indiana University. And there are good discussions to be had about these things that essentially get terminated. I'd like to talk about another example and finish with that. This is an artist, a Brazilian artist I've worked with for a while, Anita Ekman, who's a mestiza artist who has become very interested, especially in Agassiz's expedition to Brazil, the Thayer expedition. And that is one of her performances in the Atlantic rainforest. And she became interested in the images at Harvard. And I'll show you two of her photographs of two of her performances. The first one takes you can just faintly see it. The woman from one of the glass negatives, the jeune fille Mameluque, as Agassiz, as she's called in the French translation of Voyage in Brazil. And she takes those images and puts them back in the rainforest. Her interest is, and she's working with an indigenous artist and curator, Sandra Benitez, who is a Guarani artist. Her argument is essentially we need to confront the fact that Western colonialism has erased indigenous folks from the rainforest, their presence from the rainforest. The rainforest, Atlantic and Amazonian rainforests, are among the most diverse areas in the world, richest in plant diversity, animal diversity, but also in the diversity of the people who live there. Agassiz and his successors and folks extracted things from the rainforest. Her thinking is, I'll put them back in. And so she takes those images and repatriates them, so to speak. And here's another example of one of her performances, where she actually takes a book to which I contributed as well, about the Zili daguerreotypes to make their own way in the world. And she holds it up against the backdrop of the Atlantic rainforest, basically reinserting the book into it, which is kind of a reminder that of the limits of scholarly inquiry done by the likes of me, that this is always kind of an unfinished business, that, as Anita would say, the point now is to let those who were collected to be the collectors. Let them determine the future. It's not erasing Agassiz, it's contextualizing Agassiz, not pretending this didn't happen. I'm not saying that this is what renaming is about, even though one could argue there's one aspect of it. It's taking it and doing something different with it. And it's part of a longer project that she's been working on. And this has been, as I can say personally for me, the most exciting thing I've been involved in this long journey I've had with studying Louis Agassiz. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about any aspect of my presentation today. And thanks for coming again.
Looking at the time, there were clearly academic discussions going on, which may have impinged on curation.
Yeah.
But there was also this community of citizen scientists, and we don't know how much it came in contact with the academics and whether they had any concept of curation.
Yeah.
Today we have a similar issue that Thomas Kuhn wrote, The Evolution of Scientific Revolutions. And yet we get to ChatGPT and it's very poorly curated. So
Yeah.
how should we go about doing this?
So maybe different ways of answering this. First of all, Agassiz was a terrible curator himself. The museum was famous for being disorganized and out of control. The interesting thing is he was great at imagining things. He was terrible at thinking about how they might be represented, because he had this notion of getting everything into the space. At some point, he even self-critically said, "My museum is overflowing from garret to cellar," he said. There were specimens everywhere. His assistants rebelled, and they said, "We can't work under these conditions. Barrels are exploding." So his assistants were rebelling and said, "There's no concept." He had no concept of how to, in fact, go about curating something effectively. Because for him, representing the world meant including everything. And the citizen science movement that you mentioned is actually something that he, in many ways, initiated, because the Agassiz societies that emerged locally were in many ways inspired by his version of citizen science. He bridged the gap between academic and popular science. So in a sense, Agassiz had the notion that the more people I get involved in being co-curators, the more effective, the more representative the result is going to be of what I want to achieve, which is getting the totality of nature into a collection, right? His own son, Alexander Agassiz, one of the first things he did was clean up the museum and starting a sort of representative approach to natural history. Not every single specimen into the same space, but representative specimens, telling stories that rely on narratives rather than mass. For Agassiz, curation meant getting the mass of facts in one space, because that represents nature. And in a sense, Agassiz's own notion of science was already superseded in his lifetime. This is one of the kind of tragic facts, I guess, if you want to call it tragic, about him. He was essentially an 18th century person in many ways, and the world had moved on beyond him, but because of the power of his personality, he didn't realize it, and the people around it didn't realize it, that he was essentially sort of replicating something that had exhausted itself, right? In terms of curating Agassiz's legacy today, or working with Agassiz's legacy today, Anita Eggman would say that we still haven't found a way of thinking about museums that represents what she would call the decolonialization of museum spaces, which meant allowing other actors to have a say in the narratives that museums represent. Other conceptions of the natural world, which are significantly different from our own scientifically informed one. So I think we are sort of at the cusp of a development that is happening in multiple ways. I had a conversation with someone today, a curator at the Peabody Museum, who's been instrumental in confronting Agassiz's legacy, Lisa Barbash, about a recent example in Berlin, the Humboldt Forum, which is the former palace that was reconstructed, which contains ethnographic collections that the Germans collected over many, many years. Many items acquired in rather dubious ways, and the response has been largely negative. People have talked about this museum as a missed opportunity, as something that actually didn't think about museum space in different ways. Not in terms of totality, as Agassiz would have done, not in terms of representativeness, but in a self-reflexive way. How do these collections come to happen? What do they leave out? What violence is involved in collecting them? And I think there's sort of a recognition now that this is one thing that we also need to think of, the backstories, and they would need to be included. I hope that answers your question, which had multiple kind of strands to it. Yeah, I'll hand the microphone to you. Gentleman behind you.
Is there a tension between the kind of vitalism or empathy in the description of the jellyfish? You know, he doesn't anthropomorphize, he compares to other creatures, with the sense of scientists looking at nature as object, drained of life, acted on in the Enlightenment version. And I kind of saw that in the first two photographs of the people of color that you showed, because it's as if the photographers had the empathy to try to see those figures with dignity, that, you know, they were truer to Agassiz's writing than Agassiz was.
That's an excellent point. Let me get the microphone again. If I might paraphrase what you say, just to make sure that I'm understanding this, that he had an empathy or an understanding directed towards animal nature that he didn't show towards the humans that he portrayed. That's an interesting point, and one that hasn't fully occurred to me, but he, in a sense, and I only gave you one passage, so the longer passage would contain a reflection about anthropomorphism, in fact. And he's suggesting, which is rather interesting, that we should not apply anthropomorphic criteria to understanding a jellyfish, for example, that it's so beautiful precisely because it's not like us, right? Whereas, and you're absolutely right, when he thinks about racial matters, the us is the standard by which he measures what he perceives to be difference, if this makes sense. And the us is the white standard. He has a little section in Journey in Brazil, the book that his wife largely wrote, but one appendix is by him, where he talks about differences in different races. And he feels that there's an absolute standard by which they can be measured, which is his own standard. I think this is absolutely true. And one wonders what would have happened if Agassiz had left race alone and had just been content to be a scientist. He would have been a natural scientist. The premises of his science would still have been wrong because he rejected evolution. But as Darwin also recognized, his insights were valuable and important. And even after their falling out, which happened after the origin of species, which Agassiz furiously annotated, writing invectives in the margin. Stephen Jay Gould has an essay about this. Darwin kept writing to him for information. Darwin did something extreme, super brilliant in Origin of Species. He cites Agassiz a number of times, and he says, forget about what he actually believed in. His findings, especially about glaciology, they are a godsend to me. They prove what I'm trying to show. In fact, against your intention, you are delivering the best possible evidence to me, which made Agassiz probably especially furious, right? So, you know, that's a possibility. At the same time, there is a connection between the premises of a science and his racism. And it's important to realize that. His image of nature is entirely of something that doesn't move. Things get created, but they still are today. One of the reasons why he went to Brazil was looking at the fish especially, and this was so diverse. He was hoping that he could show that each species that he did work on had originated precisely where it's still to be found, because nothing in nature ever travels. And that's the same with races. Races don't intermingle because everything has to stay in their assigned places. So it's essentially a static view of nature that is totally not Darwin's anymore, right? And one thing one also has to emphasize, that if you say, okay, let's not measure his racism by the standards of the time. Take Darwin as an example. Darwin has this brilliant chapter on Origin of Species about animal instinct, and some smaller sections are about slave-holding ants. And he's showing that the instinct to keep slaves is an acquired one, which sounds like not a big deal. But if you think of it in terms of the discussion, especially in America, but slavery is a peculiar institution, as something that is endowed by God, that is in the Bible, you can understand what Darwin's chapter is doing. You know, he's essentially saying, this is not something, well, it happens, but it's acquired. It's not something that is natural. Or take Asa Gray, who, maybe it's not good science, but he did it in his manual of American botany. He said, this is only going to be about plants in the non-slave-holding states, because I have no interest investigating or writing about things in states where slaves are being held. This is, as a scientist, I can make this decision, and I'm just making it. You know, so these are the standards of the time. There are people who are thinking differently. There are even like proponents of slavery, as I show in a chapter in my book, that say, actually, scientifically, this doesn't make any sense at all. My favorite example is John Bachman, Audubon's collaborator, a naturalist in South Carolina, who's a gardener. And he says, I shouldn't even go into my garden, and I look at what the plants are doing there. You know, there's hybridization wherever I look, right? This makes no sense. He says, if we justify slavery, we need to do it on moral grounds. And I can give you these moral grounds, right? So you have to remember the context for that as well. So your argument makes sense in one way, and I think it's beautiful and something that I haven't thought about. In other ways, when we're just looking at the principles, the underlying structures of what he's thinking, then these two things are of a piece. Oh, thank you. I hope that answers your question or responds to it. It's not a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was a student at the Museum of Comparative Zoology myself, and a zoologist. And first I'll tell a short anecdote. I was invited to visit the Jewish cemetery in Vienna. There's an old cemetery that's been closed for many years and is very overgrown. And inside, we were warned not to go to one quadrant or to be careful because there were open holes in the ground. And people from the Museum of Natural History had been dispatched to the Jewish cemetery to bring back 200 skulls for the ethnographic collection. So it wasn't just in Amazonia that people were being collected in this way. But my question actually is, to what degree did Agassiz's perspective, which was in a sense old-fashioned, retard the development of evolutionary ideas or racial ideas in the Boston intellectual community, in the Saturday Club, and in these other forums?
That is an interesting question, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It didn't retard it in the case of Thoreau, for instance, and who read Origin of Species and was immediately converted. And there's a book by, I think, Randall Fuller about the book that changed America. It's sort of a grand title, but it actually does carefully reconstruct his own response to it. It did retard things in some way in the scientific community because some of his disciples who held chairs, and David Starr Jordan is an example, for instance. Nathaniel Shaler is another example. These are people who did in various ways subscribe to aspects of his anti-evolutionism in different ways. His own son did not. He was a convert to Alexander. He was a convert to Darwin's ideas without telling his father about it. It was an awkward situation, I would imagine, since they worked together. So I think to some extent, I would say by and large, it did not much to retard it. Some of credit goes to Asa Gray, who had very early on established himself as a voice of reason and authority in the debate. Asa Gray was also the one who oversaw the publication of Origin of Species in the US, which Appleton would have just brought out without Darwin being consulted on it. Asa Gray saw to it and it was done right. So I think it was, to some extent, a battle that Agassiz had lost before he even fought it. And a different question would be if we ask about the political impact of what he did. And he was, in a sense, the theorist of Jim Crow, whether it was obvious or not. His ideas were certainly something that matched what happened politically. And a good evidence for that is Elizabeth Agassiz's attempt, when she writes her husband's biography, to sanitize the account and his involvement. Because she wrote a 2-volume biography, which she started after his death, in which she, in many, many ways, tries to sanitize it, but there's an interesting footnote at one point in which she does refer to what's happening now politically, almost as a sort of confirmation of what Agassiz was advocating. So, but she doesn't include those letters that Stephen Jay Gould was the first, and he deserves credit for this, that Stephen Jay Gould drags out as evidence of Agassiz's racism. The credit to that belongs to Gould. So I think his impact has been scientifically benign, if we can say that, when it comes to the precision of his work. And there are, when I was writing this book, I worked with invertebrate biologist Tom Cronin at the University of Maryland, was sort of my go-to person, who was very reluctant to accept in some ways, but he did, of course, that is somebody with such a beautiful model was so compromised in other ways. You know, and we had conversations about that. I'm reluctant to accept it's not the right word. I mean, we had discussions about that, whether you can separate one thing from the other. Yeah. Well, thank you. Any other questions? All right, well, oh no, there's one. Yeah.
I'm not sure when Agassiz died or whether he had some final epiphany that, oh, maybe Darwin was right, and and also he seemed to have had some creationist view of evolution, that it was basically all of God's species were put on the earth and that's what we're working with. And that is a tough scientific premise to hold against Darwin. So I was just curious if he ever changed his mind and what further was his thinking against Darwin.
He never changed his mind. In fact, his last essay, published posthumously, was an attack on Darwin. And so that never happened. And there were no final words. Agassiz died of a stroke, and it was a protracted, and he hung on for a few days. There were no final words. Somehow, everyone hopes that people somehow repent, or that they, but he doesn't give us the benefit of that. The opposite story, so the good story, is Darwin. Everyone hoped that he would repent too. And his final words are among my favorite. He said, "I'm not the least bit afraid to die." And of course, there were many people who hoped after all the damage he'd done, so the more religiously minded people, that there would be this giant conversion experience. And about to meet his maker, he would say, sorry? Does sorry help? Maybe, but that was not the case. So I hate to disappoint you, but it was not, that did not happen. He did grant the Darwin, at least at times, field credentials. So he did believe some of the work, and Darwin's work, especially on invertebrates, was inspired by Agassiz. Agassiz had in fact said, this is work that needs to be done, and Darwin would be the right person. So I don't think he ever lost respect for Darwin as a field scientist, but I don't think he ever, no, there was no evidence of conversion at all. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, and have a great rest of the evening.